This is the YouTube channel for all American liberty-loving patriots. Now is the time for reasoning patriots to stand for what is just. Defend our Constitution, flag, anthem and heritage, with knowledge of our great history, and American values. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be, and one must be, wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. In the present civil war, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. And yet the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect His purpose. I am almost ready to say that this is probably true. That God wills this contest, and wills that it shall not end yet. By His mere great power, on the minds of the now contestants, He could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. Yet the contest began. And, having begun, He could give the final victory to either side any day. Yet the contest proceeds. Abraham Lincoln. Meditation on the Divine Will, 1862.
The American Civil War's unprecedented death and destruction were shocking not only to Americans, but also to foreign observers, and many at the time believed that the United States would not be able to survive such a massive conflict. From 1861 to 1865, there were an estimated 1.5 million casualties. This tremendous national suffering and carnage took a massive toll on the United States population and President Abraham Lincoln. He was a deeply religious man, and he firmly believed in God's divine will and judgment. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln famously said,
"Sir, my concern is not whether God is on our side. My greatest concern is to be on God's side, for God is always right."
The above quote from President Lincoln perfectly sums up his thinking on the core rationale for the American Civil War. 4. How could God be on the side of those wanting to promote and maintain the institution of slavery?
Men are not flattered by being shown that there has been a difference of purpose between the Almighty and them. To deny it, however, in this case, is to deny that there is a God governing the world. Abraham Lincoln, 1865.
Abraham Lincoln said the above shortly after this second inaugural address, on March 4, 1865. The great Frederick Douglass, who was in attendance, said of Lincoln's second inaugural address, "It was a sacred effort." President Lincoln gave his prophetic, sermon-like second inaugural address less than 2 months before his assassination by John Wilkes Booth, on April 15, 1865, and only a few days before the official end of the Civil War on April 9, 1865. It is just and fitting that such a great man would give one of his finest public speeches shortly before this tragic and untimely death. President Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, attempted to explain to the American people why they just endured 4 years of horrific suffering, death, and misery. He told the country that slavery is indeed a mighty offense to God, and that God now wills to remove slavery by this mighty scourge of war. He also goes on to imply that the Civil War was a divine punishment from God for the collective national sin of slavery by both Northerners and Southerners of the Union.
He, God, gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to Him?
President Lincoln's theological inaugural speech is considered one of the most important documents in American history. It was so impactful to those at the time. The London Spectator newspaper wrote,
"We cannot read it without a renewed conviction that it is the noblest political document known to history, and should have for the nation, and the statesmen he left behind him, something of a sacred and almost prophetic character."
Furthermore, those in attendance on the White House lawn on March 4, 1865, were ecstatic and emotional to be at such a historical event. Journalist Noah Brooks, who was in the audience, wrote the below passage describing the scene as President Lincoln walked from his seat to the podium.
A roar of applause shook the air, and again, repeated, finally died away on the outer fringe of the throng, like a sweeping wave upon the shore. Just at that moment the sun, which had been obscured all day, burst forth in its unclouded meridian splendor, and flooded the spectacle with glory and with light.
One could think that the sunburst that shined down shortly before President Lincoln started his speech was the eye of God himself watching the event from high up in the heavens. Before we read President Lincoln's seemingly divinely inspired second inaugural speech that was given to a United States at war with itself, think of the divided United States today, 155 years later. From a religious perspective, the United States has committed many collective sins, especially within the last generation since the 1960s. As ever-increasing, conflicting, opposing factions in the United States today fight over the soul, identity, and future of America, are we again entering into a new retribution phase? As Abraham Lincoln said, both sides cannot be on God's side, for God is always right and just. Therefore, a wrong cannot become a right, even if sanctioned by the law of a Supreme Court ruling, as slavery was the law of the land in our turbulent and soiled past.
Fellow countrymen, at this second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. Then a statement, somewhat in detail, of a course to be pursued, seemed fitting and proper. Now, at the expiration of 4 years, during which public declarations have been constantly called forth, on every point and phase of the great contest, which still absorbs the attention and engrosses the energies of the nation, little that is new could be presented. The progress of our arms, upon which all else chiefly depends, is as well known to the public as to myself, and it is, I trust, reasonably satisfactory and encouraging to all. With high hope for the future, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was, somehow, the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before, the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph, and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible, and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes, which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow, and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace, among ourselves, and with all nations.